Welcome to our channel BritNews update. So today we're looking at quite a significant development, aren't we? From that BBC News report.
Yes, that's right. It's about the ongoing investigation in Rochdale, historical child sexual exploitation.
And the main news?
Well, the headline is that 7 men have now been found guilty.
Found guilty of sexually exploiting 2 teenage girls.
Exactly. And the BBC report specifies the time frame for these offenses.
Which was?
Between 2001 and 2006. So quite a long period, 5 years.
5 years. It really does put a spotlight back on that time, doesn't it? What did the BBC piece actually detail about the nature of the abuse?
Well, it's deeply disturbing stuff. The article describes how the girls were groomed starting when they were just 13.
13.
Yeah, and treated essentially as, well, the report uses the phrase sex slaves, expected to have sex whenever and wherever they wanted. It's that grooming process, building trust, control.
Exploiting vulnerability. And the report mentioned their home lives.
It did, described as deeply troubled. And this vulnerability was, it seems, precisely what the men targeted.
How so?
By plying them with things like drugs, alcohol, cigarettes, offering them places to stay, that sort of thing, all part of the exploitation.
And the victims' testimonies highlighted by the BBC were quite powerful, weren't they?
Incredibly stark. Girl A, for example, told the jury she thought she could have been targeted by, potentially.
Right.
Well, she said hundreds of men.
Hundreds, because her number was shared.
Apparently so, yes. She found it hard to keep count.
Hmm.
And crucially, the report notes she'd actually told children's services back in 2004.
About what specifically?
About hanging around with older men, drinking, taking cannabis. So the concerns were there years ago.
Right. And girl B, she was in care at the time.
Yes, in a children's home.
Right.
And her testimony, as reported, was that police and social workers knew what was happening.
Knew?
But in her words, weren't concerned enough to do anything about it. She even mentioned reading in her own file that she'd been labeled as loitering and prostituting from the age of 10.
From 10 years old. Yeah. What about the men who were convicted? What did the report say about them?
Some were market stall holders, apparently. Others were taxi drivers.
Any key figures named?
Mohammed Zahid, known as Boss Man, a market stall holder. The BBC described him as leading the gang, giving out free goods for sex.
And he had a previous conviction.
Yes, from a 2016 grooming case, according to the report. Another man, Rohis Khan, was also mentioned as having featured in a 2013 trial.
And it wasn't straightforward getting them all to trial, was it?
No. The report mentioned Qasir Bashir absconded before the trial even started.
Right.
And 3 others, Mohammed Shahzad, Naheem Akram, and Nisar Hussain, were remanded because they were apparently planning to leave the UK, trying to evade justice.
So serious charges. Rape, indecency with a child, that sort of thing.
Multiple counts, yes. Though it's worth noting, an 8th defendant, Arfan Khan, was cleared. The prosecution offered no evidence against him.
And the trial itself wasn't smooth sailing either.
No, the BBC report mentioned they needed a second jury. Concerns about potential bias with the first one.
Complex cases.
Definitely. But the second jury reached unanimous guilty verdicts. Took them 3 weeks of deliberation.
Okay. And what about the reaction from authorities? Did the BBC cover that?
Yes, quite extensively. Greater Manchester Police, through Detective Superintendent Alan Clitheroe, admitted the victim's treatment back then was indefensible and inexcusable.
A strong admission.
Very. He acknowledged that police and other agencies had information they could and should have done something with, and we didn't. An apology was offered, and they mentioned improvements have been made since.
What about the CPS?
Liz Fell from the Crown Prosecution Service was quoted. She described the men's actions as targeting vulnerabilities, grooming for gratification, appalling treatment. And she reaffirmed their commitment to prosecute these cases relentlessly.
And Rochdale Council?
Their Director of Children's Services, Sharon Hubbard, also apologized. Said that more could and should have been done by the people who were working here at the time.
So acknowledgments of past failings.
Yes. And the NSPCC also commented, highlighting the appalling, ruthless exploitation and stressing how vital it is for children to speak out and for adults to spot the signs of grooming.
The BBC article mentioned this is part of a wider investigation, Operation Lytton?
That's right. These convictions fall under Operation Lytton. The report stated that in total, across Lytton and another one, Operation Doublet, 32 offenders have been convicted so far.
32. And more trials to come.
5 more trials are scheduled, according to the report. So it's clearly an ongoing effort.
And the sentencing for these 7 men?
The BBC reported that a date hasn't been fixed yet for that.
Okay. So, summing up, This BBC report really covers the guilty verdicts for these 7 men, but it also digs into the long history, the victims' experiences of not being heard earlier, and these official apologies for past failures, all while stressing that the wider investigation continues.
Absolutely. It paints a picture of not just individual crimes, but systemic issues and the long road to justice for victims.
Indeed. So the key factual outcome reported today is that 7 men have been found guilty of these very serious sexual offenses against 2 girls in Rochdale. Goodbye. See you in next video.